The science of sweating. What happens when we exercise? What happens when we exercise in the heat? And does heat acclimatization work? Let's start with what happens when we begin exercising. The moment our body begins to detect that we have started to exercise, our heart rate elevates, we start to breathe a little bit heavy. We have a cascade of thousands of biochemical processes that begin. Most importantly, a lot of processes focus on increasing cardiac output, increasing blood flow to working muscle. So instantly, our cardiac output increases almost tenfold. At rest, we're pumping 3 to 4 liters of blood around our body. When we're exercising, that can increase to 40 to 50 liters per minute. How does that get achieved? A couple different ways. The first and foremost is that our heart rate increases as high as 190 to 200 beats per minute while we're exercising. If we remember back to exercise physiology, we have the equation that cardiac output is equivalent to stroke rate times volume, right? And so the beat of our heart times the volume that it's beating together increases our cardiac output. Now, the volume side of the equation primarily comes when we begin to sweat. How does that happen? When we are exercising, we are converting chemical energy in our body, stored fat, stored body fat, stored carbohydrates as glycogen, and those begin to convert to mechanical energy through the process of generating ATP. Our muscles begin to move, our body begins to move. Now, what's really important here is that we are very inefficient at this. When we think about the energy conversion ratio there, we do not convert 100% of our stored or chemical energy to 100% of active kinetic mechanical energy. We lose about 80% of that energy in a very inefficient manner, and that is simply lost as heat energy, thermal energy that leaves our body. So if we're losing so much in this conversion to heat, then what happens when we're exercising and it also happens to be hot? If we're also getting very hot just at baseline, does extra heat add something to the equation? The short answer is yes, but we're going to talk about the science behind what happens when we begin to exercise in the heat. It's important to know that as humans, we primarily lose that heat energy, or we essentially try to cool ourselves down through two processes. The first being evaporation, that comes from sweat on our skin. The water vapor leaves our body, and we get a cooling effect on our skin and on our body. And the second way is convection, the movement of air against ourselves or us against the air. For example, if we're sitting on a bike, but we're underneath a fan, that is convection. Likewise, if we are running or we are biking, we are moving our body against the air. We're also getting convection. We're also losing that thermal energy to the process of convection. And so it matters that we have access to both evaporation and convection. And more importantly, the temperature and the humidity plays a huge factor in whether or not those are efficient processes or not. And so we have a couple staple cutoffs that rely on temperature. The first being that at about 20 degrees Celsius, which is about 68 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, when we're exercising at that temperature or below, we are primarily losing our thermal energy, our thermal heat load to convection. And this is essentially summarized as lower intensity at a cooler temperature. Now, as we move beyond that 20 degrees Celsius mark, that 68 to 70 degree Fahrenheit mark, we begin to switch more and more and more of our thermal load towards evaporation. We can simply summarize that is that as we begin to perform higher intensity at a hotter temperature, evaporation takes over. We also know that additional heat can be added to the system from the sun into our clothes. If we're on a bike, the absorption of radiation from the sun into things like our handlebars or our seat on a bike, there are different ways that heat energy can be added to the equation to increase our overall thermal load, aside from just what our body is producing. Now, it's really important to know that we really lose our ability to shed excess heat when we're outside, when the outside air temperature begins to exceed about 37 degrees Celsius. That is about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. That is your internal body temperature if you weren't aware of that, right? And so when the outside temperature begins to exceed the internal temperature of our body, most of our heat exchange at that point becomes evaporation. So it's really important that we're able to sweat. We have a caveat here that humidity can really throw a wrench into this equation, that if we're exercising at or above our internal body temperature, we are primarily losing heat through sweat, but that can be interrupted from humidity. Humidity, when there's already water vapor in the air, the more there is, the less our body is able to shed to evaporation. The air around our body is simply not able to accept all of the water vapor that's attempting to evaporate off our skin. If you've ever been in a tropical climate, the Caribbean, something like that, you have felt this. You have felt how awful that feels, how you can basically never stop sweating. You never really feel like your body gets a break from the heat, right? Because not only is it very, very hot air temperature, sometimes above our internal body temperature, but the air already is so humid that we're really not able to sweat. We're really not able to get the evaporative cooling effect from sweat. And you may see when you look at the temperature or something like that, it's very common to be told a real feel, a quote unquote real feel. It might be 95 degrees, but the real feel is 105 or 110. And that is simply meteorologists attempting to tell you how hotter it might feel because of the effect of humidity. So when we're exercising in the heat, especially as we get near or above our internal body temperature, it's very, very, very important that we're able to sweat. The sooner that we can sweat, the better. The more we can sweat, the better. And especially if we can do anything to mitigate the humidity, all the better. And so that brings us to the concept of heat acclimatization. So before we talk about that, I just want to take a little break and introduce myself. My name is Alan. I have the pleasure of being a faculty member here in our fitness athlete division. It is Fitness Athlete Friday, the best darn day of the week. We talk everything exercise physiology, fitness athletes, functional fitness, CrossFit, Orange Theory Boot Camp. We're also talking about endurance athletes and endurance sports, runners, swimmers, bikers, triathletes, that sort of thing. So if you're working with the recreationally active or even the competitive athlete, Fitness Athlete Friday is for you. Some courses coming your way if you want to learn from our division. Our next cohort of Fitness Athlete Level 1 online, that is an 8-week guided cohort. That begins October 14th. The next cohort of Fitness Athlete Level 2, that requires that you have taken Fitness Athlete Level 1. That course begins very, very soon, September 1st. I was just told last night that that course just has 5 seats left. That course is only taught twice per year, spring and fall. We teach 2 level 1s, and then we teach a level 2, and then we repeat that pattern again throughout the year. So if you're looking to complete your certification in the clinical management fitness athlete specialty, and you want to take that level 2 course, make sure that you take level 2 coming up in just about a week. And then if you want to come see us in person for our 2-day live course, we have a couple chances for you. The week after Labor Day, September 7th and 8th, Zach Long will be down in Austin, Texas. Joe Hanesco will be out in Longmont, Colorado, the weekend of September 14th and 15th. And Mitch Babcock will be in Texas again. That will be the last weekend of the month, September 28th and 29th. Okay, so we understand what happens when we begin to exercise. We understand what begins to happen when we exercise in the heat, how the effects of heat and humidity can affect our body. They can affect our performance. What do we do about it? We need to recognize that we need to follow heat acclimatization protocols. These are very well established, especially in endurance sports. However, in strength sports, in functional fitness, we are really lacking in understanding how the heat can impact performance and even can impact safety. It can be very mitigated by following an established acclimatization protocol. However, some organizations, some athletes just don't seem to understand the time and the preparation that needs to go into that. So let's talk about heat acclimatization. What is it? Again, when the outside temperature begins to exceed the internal or core temperature of our body, we can really only tolerate a further increase up to about 38 to 40 degrees Celsius. That's 100 to about 104 degrees Fahrenheit. At that point, when we begin to approach the upper limit of 104 degrees Fahrenheit, we are really going to experience a big resistance from our body, from our brain to continue to exercise. We're going to feel the need to slow down if we haven't already begun to slow down as it gets hotter. And we may even have a signal from our brain to our body that we need to stop entirely. And unfortunately, sometimes that signal may come too late and your brain may shut down your body for you. Some of us have unfortunately experienced heat stroke. I know, especially in the military, I've experienced that far too much. That is not a great feeling. That often comes with the need for a lot of IV hydration, a lot of time, days or weeks out of the heat, which obviously, especially with performance athletics, we can't afford to take weeks off just because we had a heat injury. And so the best thing to do is do our best to avoid that heat injury occurring in the first place. So if you're exercising in the heat, if you, whatever reason, you can't get out on the road, you can't get to the gym until the afternoon, it's already hot, for whatever reason, performance or just recreational exercise, you need to exercise in the heat, and acclimatization protocol is crucial. What happens when we exercise in the heat? We see that we get increased total blood plasma volume. And so that goes back to that cardiac output equation. Our heart rate goes up, but as we begin to sweat, our body begins to release more fluid throughout of it. We increase our plasma volume, we increase our cardiac output. We're able to maintain intensity while exercising in the heat for a longer period of time. We get improved blood flow to the skin. We see a quicker onset of sweating, sometimes pushing the ability to sweat down to the first couple minutes of exercise, maybe even while an individual is warming up, they're already beginning to sweat. That is a good sign. And overall, we get more sweat volume. The goal with an acclimatization protocol is that even if you're not a heavy sweater, even if you're somebody, it might take you 45 minutes or 60 minutes or longer, or maybe you're somebody that never really even sweats when you work out. With an acclimatization protocol, we want to see sweat begin within 5 to 10 minutes of exercise. And especially in high heat environments, especially if the intensity is going to be high, we want to see that sweat begin sooner rather than later. It's not a bad thing to be a sweaty sweater, especially if you're exercising in the heat. We have a really good paper back from 2010 from Lorenzo and colleagues, the Journal of Applied Physiology, a protocol and research done on that protocol that is pretty well established now on heat acclimatization. We know that it improves exercise performance. In this study, they had two experimental groups. Each group did 10 sessions of 2 rounds of 45 minutes of biking at 50% VO2 max with a 10-minute break in between. And now the heat group performed this at 40 degrees Celsius, which is 104 degrees Fahrenheit, in a 30% humidity room. Now, the other group, the control, or what we might think of as the cold or normal temperature, room temperature group, performed the same study, except they did it at 13 degrees Celsius, which is about 55 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can imagine that is very similar to working out in your basement, working out in an air-conditioned gym, something like that. And so they worked out colder, significantly colder than the heat group. And now the study looked at VO2 max and lactate threshold between these two different groups. And they had these two different groups test in a cold environment and a hot environment. So they did this VO2 max lactate threshold test in a cold room, 13 degrees Fahrenheit, 13 degrees Celsius, 55 degrees Fahrenheit. And then also in a hot room, although not as hot as the heat training group, 38 degrees Celsius or 100 degrees Fahrenheit, about 4 degrees cooler. What they found is the folks who trained at the high heat, higher humidity protocol had significant improvements in their VO2 max, both in the hot heat, the higher heat test protocol, the 100 degrees Fahrenheit, but they also began to sweat earlier, had improved VO2 max when they trained in the cold environment as well, the 55 degree Fahrenheit room. Compared to the folks who did a room temperature or otherwise climate controlled training sessions, they did not have those improvements. So the individuals who trained at 55 degrees Fahrenheit had no improvement in their VO2 max. And some of the subjects in that group even showed a decrease when they were asked to perform in both the colder and the warmer environments. And so what we see is that heat acclimatization has a significant improvement on our performance, both when we're exercising in the heat. That makes sense. Exercising in the heat makes you better at exercising in the heat. But also we saw performance carryovers to folks who are regularly exercising in the heat, who then maybe go inside the air conditioning, whatever. And so the key takeaway from that is that we need to perform longer, low intensity sessions in the heat to create the adaptations necessary to allow us to perform more intense training outside, right? It's obviously intuitive that if you want to work out in the heat, you should work out in the heat more. But we know that we need to accommodate for those sessions being lower intensity when we're getting our body used to the heat before we try to just ramp up the intensity and pretend like the heat doesn't have a factor. And so far too often, what do we see? We see folks that train in a climate controlled condition, an air conditioned gym. They're running on a treadmill in their basement, something like that. It's cool and dry. And they train like that, maybe for their whole training cycle. And then they go do their event that is outside. That is a recipe for a heat injury. If we know we have a run outside, if we know we have a CrossFit competition outside, whatever, those folks need to be training for a pretty long period of time, definitely several weeks, maybe even several months if they're not used to working out in the heat. And we need to give those folks time to be able to introduce low intensity sessions that are longer to get the body used to exercising in the heat, to allow those adaptations to occur, the increased total blood plasma volume, blood flow to the skin, quicker onset of sweating, and overall an increase in total sweat volume. That doesn't happen with one session. That needs, again, maybe weeks or months of training in the heat to get our body to the level where it is ready for a high intensity session outside in the heat, outside in the humidity. So what happens when we begin to exercise? Thousands of chemical processes, the most important related to sweating, keeping our body temperature down so that we're able to sustain intensity for longer periods. What happens when we exercise in the heat? We do pretty well exercising in the cold, but as air temperature approaches our body temperature, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, we see that intensity naturally drops. We see that performance drops, and we need to be aware that heat can be added to the system outside of just what the current air temperature is, the sun on our clothes, the sun on our equipment, whatever, and that humidity also plays a big factor. That as we cross the relationship between outside air temperature and internal body temperature, we primarily lose heat due to evaporation. And it's really crucial that we sweat. And that comes through a heat acclimatization protocol. We need to recognize that we need to have, again, weeks or months at lower intensity to build our body up to have the capacity to hammer a high intensity event out in the heat. And that we know if it's not done correctly, it can be unfortunate performance inhibition for folks. And unfortunately, it can even be a heat injury that may cause harm to the athlete, which we want to avoid. So if you're working out in the heat, or you need to work out in the heat, or you're working with a patient or athlete who does, make sure you talk to them about a heat acclimatization protocol. I hope this was helpful. I hope you all have a fantastic Friday. If you're going to be at a live course this weekend, have a great time. We'll see you all next time. Bye, everybody.